All right. Basics. What is this? Episode 8. I'm coming to you, gentlemen, live from my sister-in-law's bedroom. Sister-in-law's master bedroom. There's a, what is it? It's a queen. I'm actually surprised looking at it. I was kind of thinking they had a king. Queen bed. It's actually a pretty clean room. But yeah, I'm on a family trip. I'm up in the Twin Cities and making do with a makeshift studio. But I'm pumped to be here. How is everybody?
Good. Hey, are you talking shit about queen beds there? I mean, are you some kind of an elitist that only has a king size only?
I'm king or bust. I'm a king maximalist. What do you guys have, by the way? Daz, what do you have? King. What are you in the king, of course?
You know, and you don't talk to us about like proper parenting because we've still got like 7-year-olds in the bed majority of the time. So, you know, king bed maximalist.
Yeah, you have to.
Space, bro.
Seb, what are you rocking?
Are you preferring when it's wider than it is long? Is that what you're saying? Because I think that when it comes to,
I feel like this is going to go quickly down the wrong hole here.
I like to sleep in a massive chode. That's my favorite. Josh, you're seriously.
I'm in a queen, man. Like, I just haven't upgraded. I bought a nice mattress, and I'm like, it's big enough for my wife and I. And when it is kind of nice that there's not enough room for kids. Like, sorry, you don't fit. Get out of here.
That is a good excuse, a sound excuse, a valid excuse. That gets the wheels turning.
So you still rocking the single, or?
I'm on the single right now because my parents are in town. The parents are in town, so they're in the main bedroom, and I'm in the spare bedroom. But have you ever seen what is it? They've got is it the California King? Is that the biggest one?
That's the big long one, yeah.
That's massive.
Actually, the California BBC of beds. I think the California is a tad narrower but longer. Much longer.
Me then.
So yeah, Seb, your parents are sleeping in your bed.
Yeah.
Wow. That's I figure Seb Bunney's parents fuck pretty hard. So that's a little bit disturbing.
Hopefully they're holding back for you.
I know they are. It's like the reverse. Like normally when you go back home, right? You bring your girlfriend or your wife back to your childhood bedroom. It's like everybody gets horny and you bang it out. It's like in reverse for Seb's parents. It's like they're staying with their son. They get in that environment. They get more horny, Josh. So I would look out.
Those sheets, Seb. Wow. I bet you didn't want to think about that today.
Well, I'm in the room next to them, so they're awfully quiet. So,
I will say, shout out to the Minneapolis Bitcoin meetup. Brandon Quidham and the squad was nice enough to have me out last night. Josh was too lazy to make the drive, so it was just me solo mission.
Too lazy.
Gave a little talk, but great, vibrant meetup in Minneapolis. There were I don't know, I think someone said 90 people show up at Oshanahassee. I may or may not be pronouncing that right. Distillery, gorgeous place. Guy that owns it's a big Bitcoiner. Just an awesome meetup. And in typical fashion at these meetups, we haven't been to many, but as we say, the space is 70% super squared away, intelligent, intellectual, awesome people, and 30% complete fucking weirdos. And last night was representative of that breakdown as well, Josh.
Yeah, it sounds about accurate. Dan is just the attention whore that drives 5 hours to go talk to people for 30 minutes. I get it. Totally understand.
Yep, just that's how it works.
He wants to be on a pedestal. He wants to talk down to all the plebes. And
Josh does all the dirty work and I take all the glory. So, yep.
So today, we didn't even really. So Daz, what's going on with you? You had a puppy just before we started recording. Where did that cute little guy go?
Not a scam. Yeah. So we got, I don't know, a couple episodes ago, I might have told you that we got Facebook scammed for a couple $100 for a puppy. But so this one arrived, mail order, had to come on a plane, believe it or not. Jesus Christ. Anyway, it's another rabbit hole for another day. But yeah, no, puppy arrived safe and sound. Scout Satoshi B. That's his name.
Nice.
I had to get the Satoshi in there. The kids were like, "What?" I'm like, "Come on, boys, get on board, get on board."
Nice. So what? The kids love him. They're happy.
I actually wanted to call him Oshi, so we could just go sit, Oshi, sit. And but anyway, dad joke didn't go down.
Yeah, we'll have to bring him back on before we end this thing. So today, boys, the topic, Bitcoin Basics, episode 8, like Dan said, and we are talking about Bitcoin base layer and then how these tertiary layers are built, why they're built, and just, I guess, elucidate the points and why it is that Bitcoin needs secondary layers, what it is that is lacking potentially on the base layer, and the reason why those things are possibly lacking. I think we're going to get into a lot of that today. There's a lot to unpack here. I think it's good that we start off talking about some of the trade-offs and reasons for these trade-offs. This is basically the idea called the blockchain trilemma. I'm sure the three of you guys are familiar with it. It's basically that there are three pedestals, or like a triangle you could imagine. Security being one side of it, decentralization being another, and then scalability. So on the security front, auditability, which is a huge part of the security aspect. So how is it that we know there are only 21 million Bitcoins? How do we audit that and verify it for ourselves? Rhetorically, the answer is a node and the ability to actually see them. And that's the shortcoming with like zero knowledge proofs with tokens like Monero or Zcash. There's not necessarily a way to actually audit everything because it's all opaque. So Bitcoin is not as private as it could be for the reason of accountability. We want to be able to see that we all have this limit of 21 million coins, and we can see that everyone else has that limit. On decentralization, more nodes is more decentralization. And decentralization is the permissionlessness. Democratization of the nodes allows users to control the characteristics of the network and not allow anyone to take over or bad actors to kind of put the network in a direction that we don't want. And then scalability, which is simply the ability to handle high amounts of transactions. More bandwidth means more storage, and nodes have to be more expensive to run and set up. So all of these trade-offs are for decentralization and censorship resistance. That is the basic reason that we have these trade-offs. Even Adam Back himself said in 2014 that he tried to improve with this trilemma by changing some of the characteristics, and he found that Bitcoin just fit very, very squarely in the sweet spot where adjusting any of these parameters would cause issues with one of the other ones. And I think he was the first person to actually suggest that we should have tertiary or secondary layers on Bitcoin in order to improve some of these characteristics.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Essentially, if I was going to summarize sort of what you introduced there, Josh, it's that the base layer of Bitcoin cannot do everything. When we talk about monetary systems, monetary technologies, protocols in general, even that stem outside of money, one specific layer cannot handle it all. And I think that this is something that's been represented more broadly in monetary systems, which I think is worth getting into. Maybe I'll shelve that. Someone else can take it. We'll get to it. But the point here is the base layer of Bitcoin is intended to be boring and highly secure, to do one thing very, very well, and that is enforce a fixed supply cap of censorship-resistant global money. Now, as we think through all the other applications that are going to be necessary, things like payment applications, and the list is going to go on here today, the key is to be able to do that without sacrificing that base most important use case. So it's been discovered really over the last 15 years that it's very hard to do it all on one layer. We need more layers. And there is probably someone listening that's like, what are you guys even talking about? There's a stack of protocols that are being built on top of Bitcoin. We talk about this analogy all the time. We're beating a dead horse potentially, but I'll say it again. The internet is not all one protocol. You have TCP/IP at the base layer and a ton of things built on top of it. HTTPS, SMTP. Bitcoin base layer is being built on, and it's happening very quickly. The most prominent second layer that's out there is the Lightning Network, but there's other ones that we could get into. Things built on Lightning like Taro, things like Arc, sidechains like Liquid. These are all things we'll touch over this hour.
No, and I think both you guys bring up such good points, and I wanted to just really reiterate one point in particular, which is Bitcoin, we're really trying to be decentralized. And going back over, and I think we discussed this in one of the previous episodes, which is, well, if we increase, like Bitcoin, for instance, has about 7 transactions per second. And if we increase that to 100, 200, 300, well, isn't that better? And the reality is that, as we've discussed, transactions take up data. And so if you increase the transaction volume per second, well, then that's going to consume more data. So at-home node runners can no longer kind of go to their local PC store and buy a SD card or a hard drive that can effectively carry that storage space to be able to account for this increased transaction. So because of that, we want to focus on decentralization and minimal transaction speed in order to maximize the capacity of the Bitcoin network. And being able to expand in terms of layers is where we achieve these other benefits. And the traditional monetary system is exactly the same. When we look at the traditional monetary system, what most people don't necessarily recognize is that at the very base level, like level zero, effectively, we have FedWire in the US. So FedWire allows for the Federal Reserve to be able to interact with the central banks. And then above that, you've got interbank lending or interbank kind of transactions, such as like SWIFT and so on, which allows the banks to be able to communicate with one another and send money between one another. And then on top of that, you've got layer 3, and you've got things like credit cards and debit cards. And then you've got, in Canada, we've got e-transfers. I don't know what they're called in the US. And so we've built this layered system with all of them offering different benefits and obviously advantages and disadvantages. And that's the same with Bitcoin. We're not trying to accommodate everyone and everything. We're trying to build a modular approach, build things on top of Bitcoin base layer, ensuring that we have a sound, stable layer at the base.
And I think that's where we saw the proliferation of a lot of these shit coins over time, particularly in 2017, where they were looking at the engineering problems of potentially Bitcoin's base layer, not realizing that we would be able to stack protocols on top to such a degree that we've been able to achieve. So they were trying to pivot and trying to take some of these trade-offs on that trilemma in order to be able to scale. So if we were going to be able to, compete with a Visa network, which settles billions of transactions in a day, it was never going to be achieved on Bitcoin's base layer. So that's where we saw the proliferation of these alternative currencies. But now as we accelerate through time, we're able to look back, we're able to really critically assess what the trade-offs were. And most of the time, those trade-offs were around security and decentralization, which is, it sort of goes against the thesis of why Bitcoin exists in the first place. We're trying to remove that trustless relationship with intermediaries, and we're trying to remove, as much as possible, put it as a decentralized protocol, put the power back into the hands of the users. And that's where we've seen, if we talk about again, which we've brought up a couple of times throughout this series with Ethereum, that's probably the best, number two sort of coin. And they've had to make massive trade-offs in order to get that scalability for what they wanted to do on the base layer. And it's resulted in a mass concentration of centralization. So there are people involved in that project who have a lot of say over how that works, what the fundamental protocol is, what the monetary supply is, what the monetary policy is, as well as now we're in this proof of stake where you're getting a lot of concentration of like even being able to decide who is and who is not allowed to transact, which is totally against the thesis of why this thing exists in the first place. So
exactly. Yep.
I might throw it back to you guys to see if you got anything to add there, Dan.
Yeah, I think that this has been a great place to start. Basically, what we're saying is that what we know about these systems as we try to create robustly decentralized immutable money, that's the whole point of Bitcoin, is that enforcing monetary immutability and enabling huge throughput of transactions. Those two things are not possible, as we've said, on the same protocol. Like, for example, Visa, I think, does like tens of thousands of transactions a second. Bitcoin does 3 to 5 transactions a second. So there is not much throughput on the Bitcoin base layer. The problem is when you try to get Visa throughput on the base layer of a money protocol, you sacrifice, as you said, Daz, you sacrifice the whole point here. The thing becomes centralized. And Ethereum, which we said, I think we hinted at this in the Bitcoin Not Crypto episode, but at this date and time, it takes like $20,000, like a $20,000 computer to run an Ethereum node and a ton of technical chops, not to mention just bandwidth requirements, energy usage, right? So to have a robustly decentralized node network, you can't do this all on the base layer. I think an apt comparison would be a lot of these other crypto tokens that are trying to do everything. They're trying to build 100, 200-year foundations of a house using the same materials that they're trying to build a gorgeous master bathroom with on the 3rd floor. It's just not possible. This needs to be built out in layers. And as these layers get built, and I think this is one of the things we need to hint on, you can't lose the bare decentralized component here. And that's the beauty of Lightning, is that most Bitcoin layers are different than legacy layers in finance because there's no intermediaries. So as we build these, we need to build them responsibly. And I think that's what we've seen so far in the early stages of Bitcoin.
And I think just to give like a physical example, I was just looking it up, like Solana, which has 10 megabyte block sizes and much quicker blocks, whereas Bitcoin is sitting at around 1 megabyte, sometimes because of the way they actually account for them. They're slightly bigger than that. And we're obviously every 10 minutes. Solana has only been around for a few years, and their node, in order to run a node, you need a 100 terabyte hard drive. Like the average individual cannot go and buy a 100 terabyte hard drive. It is an impossibility. And so when you look at how many nodes they've got a couple thousand nodes, and most of those, I would argue, are underneath a handful of companies. So there's probably only a handful of actual individuals operating those nodes that are able to monitor the ledger. Whereas when we look at Bitcoin, I don't know, I haven't looked at it recently, but the last time I looked, we have tens of thousands of public nodes and many more private nodes that aren't necessarily signaling. So I think it's fascinating when you dive into the decentralization aspect, because Bitcoin does not want to compromise on that.
Folks, we're going to take a moment here to announce our newest partner here at Blue Collar Bitcoin, and that is Heatbit. Josh and myself, Dan, found this product at Bitcoin 2023, and it immediately stood out to the two of us. Heatbit makes a badass 3-in-1 device. It's a Bitcoin miner, a heater, and an air purifier all in one. This puppy uses the same amount of energy as any regular heater, and it generates $20 to $25 worth of Bitcoin every month you use it. It's incredibly aesthetically pleasing, dare we say sexy. It uses cutting-edge tech with 5-nanometer mining chips, and it's compact and quiet. To top it off, the price point is beyond accessible, starting at just $299. Earn passive income in Bitcoin while heating and purifying your home, and control the entire thing from a sleek and easy-to-use app. Go to heatbit.com, that's heatbit.com, and start hashing at home. And
this goes back to the block size wars. We've brought this up a couple of times as well throughout this series. So it's a really good book to read, the block size wars. Forget the author. But it gives you a good framework of what happened in 2017 when there was a big sort of push from mainly miners and exchanges to increase the block size to enable more throughput on. And what that would have meant, like Seb's just highlighted, is it would have very quickly meant that running a node would have been outside of the ability for most normal people with a normal PC and access to normal hardware in order to be able to run a node at home. It would have meant that the blockchain would have inflated. And the block sizes that they were proposing would have only been like a Band-Aid solution for the scalability. They still would have been saturated at some point. So it wasn't solving the base layer issue of scalability. It was like putting a Band-Aid fix in, perhaps we could just make them a little bit bigger, right? And then we could put a few more transactions into that base layer block. But it was still only a Band-Aid problem. It was still only a finite amount of transactions that you would have been able to fit into that block, and thus also putting it outside of the ability for most people to be able to run a node at home, which is where Bitcoin's decentralization really exists, is that ability for anybody to participate in the network.
Sure. And just to put a good point on that, if I want to run a Bitcoin node right now, so Dan, you said Ethereum takes around $20,000 of computer equipment. You also have to pile on top of that, I believe it's 32 ETH you need to have in order to actually run this thing. So now you're looking at a price of like, I don't know, anywhere from 50 to 70,000, depending on what the price is at the moment. Right now, I just looked it up. Start9's selling their most basic server, which can run a Bitcoin node, has everything you need, plug and play, for $219. Or alternatively, you could just grab some off the shelf surplus part computer from eBay for probably $100. You could put their software on it and you could be running it very quickly. And we're talking about $100 to $200 of the parts here versus $50,000 to $70,000. That should put a pretty good exclamation point on exactly what we're talking about here. This is extremely easy. Almost anyone in the world can afford to spend $100 to run their own node, verify, and check their own Bitcoin wallet themselves. It just allows this decentralization to be tens of thousands of nodes. The other thing I wanted to add to what Seb was saying, there's two ways you could create more transactions on the base layer. It could either be bigger blocks, or they could change the block time. They could make the block time 2 minutes. The problem with Seb already elucidated what the bigger blocks do. The problem with these faster blocks is that synchronization becomes an issue at some point. And Satoshi chose 10 minutes because that allows this information to disseminate across the world so that miners can be competitive with each other. You don't have all of these orphan blocks and issues on the blockchain when you have a 10-minute period of time. So there's a lot of reasons that this thing was set up with the parameters it has at the base layer.
Yeah. I'm going to read a couple quotes here from Lynn Alden's piece, which cannot recommend enough. If you're really curious about the Lightning Network, her piece, A Look at the Lightning Network, is awesome. It's on
Beautiful.
Swan's blog. It's also on lynnalden.com. She sort of summarizes some of what we've been talking about here for the first 15 minutes. She says, many cryptocurrencies that followed in Bitcoin's wake put the cart before the horse. They optimized for throughput and speed on their base layer at the cost of weaker decentralization, auditability, scarcity, and or immutability of the underlying bearer asset. As such, they failed to gain structural adoption as money and rendered their high throughput irrelevant. That's the part that matters at the end. Who gives a fuck if you have high throughput on cuckbucks or monopoly money or nonsense casino token? She also says, in order to create a decentralized version of Visa, beneath that, you must first create a decentralized version of Fedwire. And along with that, you must first create a decentralized version of digital gold. I think this point is just so important. For throughput to matter, for a payments network to matter, the underlying liquidity, the asset that's being moved, needs to have a purpose, a use case, and a fit to begin with, right? And that's what Bitcoin presents. Bitcoin fills a hole in 21st century monetary land, a very important hole. And then once that hole is filled and people want to accumulate this store of value asset, now there's even a point to having the conversation of how do we move it around?
There's another, actually, I was reading the same piece. Surprisingly, we both took a lot of this info from Lynn because she's such a genius. And yeah, also highly recommend that piece. But she made a few points on what we're talking about here, which is in order to increase number of transactions, you're giving up bandwidth, storage requirements, running a node. I mean, you're pushing this to the point where most people can't do it. It has centralization pressures on the network. And she makes the point, like you said, Dan, if you're going to make something that performs like Visa at the base layer, you basically have to recreate Visa. You have to make this thing a very centralized entity, which then completely nullifies the entire reason for its existence, which is a money that the world can use without permission in a censorship-resistant way. You've completely negated it.
It's also to transition here. You have to think about what place Visa sits in the current monetary stack. Visa is way, way, way far removed from final settlement. I'll intro this, and then I think this is something to riff on, because this is a place, I think, in discussing Bitcoin that it is actually worth comparing to legacy finance and how monetary systems are built. Just to start here, there's really kind of four layers I'll highlight in today's monetary system. You've got a base layer, which is like central banks. When Lynn's talking about Fedwire, that's essentially central banks moving money around. Then you have sort of an intermediary layer. We'll call that commercial banks, financial institutions. Then there's a payments layer. We'll call that layer 3, payments networks, clearinghouses, settlement systems. And then finally, you get to the application layer, financial products, financial services, your Venmos, your Cash Apps of the world. So something like Visa is so far removed from bare final settlement of an asset. And I think that's really important to highlight, because what Visa's trying to do and what Bitcoin base layer is doing are on really opposite ends of the monetary spectrum. And what something like Lightning can do also shouldn't be confused with Visa, because we are dealing with final settlement on the Lightning Network. It's not a debt instrument. It's happening there and then. And that's a key distinction. Once again, maybe we'll shelve that for later in the conversation. Go ahead, Seb.
Yeah, I was just going to add, even just examples. When we're talking about Fedwire, which is arguably the base of the US system, if you wanted to compare it to something like Bitcoin, there's only a few hundred transactions, I believe, a year. And those transactions, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in size. They're massive. And I think this is where, when we look at Bitcoin extrapolating out into the future, if Bitcoin is to go to where I think many of the Bitcoin community believe it is going to go, eventually it will be at a point where if I'm, say, buying a house for 300,000, $1 million or whatever, at that point, yes, I may do something on the base layer because I want that security above all else. Whereas I'm not going to be buying a coffee on the base layer just as if you wouldn't buy a coffee on the base layer of Fedwire. And so more having this understanding that each layer serves a purpose. And as you move up the layers, you get increased speed and efficiency, but at a sacrifice usually of whether it's a little bit of decentralization, usually you're going to sacrifice something. And I think that's what we have to be aware of. We're not going to be buying houses on Lightning, but at the same time, we're not going to be buying coffee on the base layer, and recognizing the pros and cons to each.
And this idea of settlement is really important too, because I've got an example just of this week. So I went to a pub for lunch the other day, and their FPOS machine, which is what we call our bank card transfer in Australia, was playing up. They ended up charging me twice. I've just logged in now. It was 2 days ago. Those transactions are still pending. They were Visa transactions. They're still sitting in as pending. So she wouldn't give me a refund based on the fact that there was 2 transactions there until she said, you're going to have to come back to us once that transaction's been settled and then prove to us that it's gone through twice. So it's a pain in my ass to have to go back there to redeem that. And it was 2 days ago. Those transactions are still pending on my app. So like, it's not even that fast. Like the immediate transaction, the immediate notification that thing's gone through, but the settlement, like we've highlighted here, is so far removed from the process of that initial transaction that that can be reversed at any time. Like I could call my bank and say it's a fraudulent transaction. I'll put a halt on it. So that whole idea of final settlement, like arguably, if we look at it and we compare it to our current financial system, the other thing that we haven't really highlighted is the fact that bearer asset transaction proof is when you go to physically withdraw that cash from the bank account. And there's so many claims on those dollars. For that to be a bearer final settlement, we operate within a fractionalized reserve banking system whereby now there's not even a peg. It used to be 10% as a guide. So you would go and put $100 into the bank account. They would basically deem that as a 10% reserve, and then they could lend out up to 90% further value. So it's inflating the currency supply. So if all of us went to our ATMs and to withdraw our cash, the whole banking system would collapse because there's actually not that much physical bearer asset underpinning the claims that we have within the banking system.
Yeah, I think that, actually talking about that, kind of an example came to mind, which is that I just recently, I've been a subscriber to Real Vision for about 7 or 8 years. And last year I decided, I was like, you know what? I'm just focusing on Bitcoin. I don't necessarily need Real Vision. Anyway, I completely blanked that I still had my membership, and it renewed the other week. And I was just like, God damn it. It's like freaking what was it? It was like $5.99 US. So after it went through on my credit card.
Holy shit. That's what they're charging a year?
That's what they're charging. So it was $5.99 US. And after it renewed on my credit card.
Your butthole is getting stretched out, Seb. That's crazy. Wow.
I split it with like 10 friends. But it goes through $5.99 US, comes through at like, I think it was $7.50 Canadian or something at the time. And so I caught it on my credit card. I was like, fuck, I forgot to cancel my subscription to it. So then I call up, I send them an email and I just said, hey guys, like, unfortunately, I'm not in the position right now that I need to renew it. Would I be able to grab a refund? So they refund me after we're dealing with the exchange fees, the foreign exchange fees, transaction fees on my credit card, the refund and so on. They initially charged me $7.50. They initially charged me $8.19 and they refunded me $7.50. So you're talking about like $70, $80. You're talking about 10% in fees. It's so the traditional system, because of all of the intermediaries involved, we don't necessarily need to go through that right now, but we're talking about 4 or 5 intermediaries touch that money before it came back into my bank account. And each one of those intermediaries is taking a cut. It's a very inefficient system.
And it's like anytime you do a transaction buying a house or any kind of settlement like that, you really realize how slow this system is. You sit there. I mean, I've been in house closings where it takes 8 hours to close because the wire didn't come through because of what you just said, Seb. You have all these intermediaries. All of them have to touch this money and then send it off. And it is extreme. Like, people complain about the base layer of Bitcoin being slow. I mean, you can, as long as your transaction fee is good, you can be fairly confident and good to go in like 20 to 30 minutes. This, we're talking about potentially days and weeks. If things get caught up, you have to call 3 different intermediaries, get this all sorted out. And now your house closing takes two, you have to do it 2 weeks later because of all these wire issues. And I just wanted to point out here that even though the base layer of Bitcoin may not be like lightning fast because of the way it's designed, it's still massively and probably an order of magnitude better than like a wire transfer is as far as speed is concerned.
And those, just going back to Seb's point with these intermediaries as well, it's like one of the attacks on cash as a system is because there's so many intermediaries scalping fees in the interim every time that changes hands. Where if you've got a $50 note and I give it to Josh and he gives it to Dan and he gives it to Seb, we've basically enacted 3 transactions there, and no one scalped any fees off the top of that. Whereas if we did that in the same financial system and, you're taking your 2% for the transaction fee, so is Dan before it gets to Seb, then that $50 value has actually been eroded. So while we're moving towards more and more of a digital, and don't get me wrong, if you're providing a service, I actually see value in a transaction fee. I absolutely do resonate with that. And that's how Bitcoin works. The miners are providing a service. So this whole idea of transactions like being free necessarily, if you've got to expend computational power and so forth, absolutely, I'm fully supportive of that. But that's not the point I was trying to make. But the attack on cash specifically is more, I think, around that. Hey, we're not making any fees in this transaction. Let's force people into these systems where we can scalp off the top.
That's a really good clarification, Daz. Fees make sense when there's a value add. Okay? When there's a value add, people should pay. And those that are providing value should expect payment. The issue with today's monetary system is that there's a ton of people sifting money off the top that, in my opinion, are adding very little to no value. One thing I want to clarify is, we've talked about this, and this is a pretty dense topic. This might be a little bit more 201, but we're at whatever. We're in the thick of it. The way that the current system works above Fedwire, let's say, just to make it simple, is it's a debt-based system. Somebody owes someone. So when you're talking about a pending transaction, Daz, the issue is that within the plumbing, somebody owes someone, right? Let's think about a simple transaction. Let's dull it down here. You buy a coffee. There are, I just wrote down 5 people involved. There's let's say the credit card holder, the merchant, the acquiring bank. That's the bank that works with the merchant to process the card payment. The issuing bank, that's the bank that issued the credit card to the card holder. And then the card association, the organization that manages the credit card network. And that's like at its most simple. That's 5 people involved. And there's 3 individuals in there that are basically all siphoning their cut. Let's say that the average transaction fee in commerce today is 2.5% to 5%. That's really significant, man. Before I became a firefighter, I managed a golf course. I remember what our line item was for credit card payments. It was astonishing. Okay. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin works very differently. Here's a tweet I sent the other day. In Bitcoin, the message is the settlement. There's no debt layer above the settlement layer like the legacy system. And with second layers like Lightning Network, settlement happens instantaneously, a huge upgrade to 21st century payments. We are going to get into Lightning and how it works, but it's a lot different than a credit card. It may work just as fast, and the micropayments can be even smaller, but it's immediate and final settlement of a digital sound bearer asset. Can you say freaking upgrade? Now, one clarification before I pass the baton here. It's not as though there's not going to be any debt-based layering on Bitcoin. There is going to be responsible banking, and there are going to be intermediaries, but they're going to be held to greater account because they are going to have to provide value, because there is a way. There will be ways. There will, and these manners will continue to expand, and there will be ingenuity that's creating different ways to settle. There will be a way to do it at very low cost. So if you're going to charge something, you're going to have to provide something. It's not just going to be the water that we swim in Bitcoin commerce. The
massive difference too is going to be, like, right now we have 4, it's an oligopoly in credit cards, right? There's 4 major companies, and their fees can remain higher than they potentially would be with more competition, because these companies have kind of forged their way a moat. Kind of like Warren Buffett talks about, when you're going to invest in something, make sure you invest in something with a moat. Well, these credit card companies have one hell of a moat, and they can charge 2.5% to 5% because they can basically price fix. The difference here is that Lightning is also an open protocol, just like Bitcoin. And there's like 4 implementations of it right now. And anyone and everyone is allowed to compete on it. And so this is a commodity, the price of a transaction. it will be forced down as companies are forced to compete with each other on top of it, because there is no way to create a moat in this kind of a situation. And I think that's an important thing to make sure people understand. Go ahead, Seb.
I was going to say as well, recently I read this book, and this book blew my mind. I don't necessarily agree with the reader's kind of end thesis, but he brought up a really good point. This book's called Sacred Economics by a guy called Charles Eisenstein. And one of the things he discusses in this book, which I thought was incredible, is the fact that when you have a debt-based system, you need growth. If you do not get growth, the system naturally collapses. And so this is why our government targets GDP growth. Now, the problem with this is, Jeff Booth talks a lot about this, is we live in a deflationary world. Prices are always declining, or should be naturally declining, because technology advances and it's trying to get more for less. And so the problem with this is, if we need growth, yet prices are declining, well, then that means that in order to achieve this growth, we have to continually monetize everything. And so exactly to Daz's point, transaction fees, or cash doesn't have transaction fees. Now we need to, because GDP is denominated in dollars, we need to make that transaction visible on the dollar network. So we now need to turn that into a digital payment. There needs to be someone taking a cut. We need to be able to turn all of these exchanges that were once, whether it was just a gift, whether it was something you were being altruistic, you need to be able to monetize these transactions in order to have them included underneath the GDP framework. And that's where something like Bitcoin, when you have a fixed supply of money, all of a sudden it aligns with our inherently deflationary world where prices should be declining, and it incentivizes us to be very cautious when it comes to debt consumption. Because if prices are declining and we cannot necessarily generate as much return as we did previously, then that means if we take on debt, we're going to quickly become overburdened in debt.
Well, before we move on to actually talking about how Bitcoin works, I just want to point out, not Bitcoin, I'm sorry, how Lightning works. I just want to point out one use case for removing these intermediaries, which Lightning Network has effectively done, that is opened up because of this. Fountain is a really cool podcast 2.0 app. You can listen to your favorite podcast, get paid in very small payments. We're talking like cents throughout the listening to this entire podcast. You can thumbs up and you can boost, give them 10 sats for something that you appreciated or thought was good during the podcast. All of these very small microtransactions are something that is just not possible with the traditional market, like with the credit card companies, because of their fees and because of their minimums. So this opens up an entire gamut of different ways that you can reward content creators. And kind of like the way I think Lynn in that piece also talked about how when the smartphone was invented in 2007, you could have never predicted that Uber was going to overturn taxis 5 to 10 years later, right? That's where we're at at the point we're at with Lightning right now. It's pretty obvious that transactions being small and fast is great, but we really can't predict what exactly that's going to change in the near future, 5 years from now. Who's going to invent something incredibly cool that can't be done right now because of the rails and because of the way they're slow and expensive? There's going to be a lot of innovation, most of it unpredictable, but all of it's going to be great.
And this is, it's a really good point, man, because these micropayments, where our sort of billing systems and everything for services that we use tend to work on some sort of payment term, typically like a monthly bill for a phone service, energy bills, all that sort of thing. So in Australia for a long time there, we had quarterly energy bills. So as a wage earner, that was like a debt that was going to come, and it was quite a hefty chunk. If you were living pay to pay, it's quite a hefty chunk to come up with. When they were just trying to minimize costs for sending meter readers out to go and, read these energy bills. So what these micropayments are going to enable is for humans to navigate where they use things and pay for value at the time of usage, rather than accumulating more sort of these debt-based sort of systems for billing services. So rather than you on the 15th of every month getting a big stack of bills where you're like, holy shit, as a wage earner or as a single mom or as a single income, you're panicking how you're going to pay for these bills that you've accumulated over without real-time tether to your usage, particularly with energy. And I think this is a really critical point as we're navigating this, where energy prices are starting to really, really soar globally. Micropayments enable, and there's absolutely projects working on this right now, integrating like Lightning services for real-time payments of energy. So basically you are paying per minute for your energy usage. So you can have a real-time navigation around what is this actually costing me now. I'm looking at my house, you might get an alert. You might have a threshold to say, holy shit, mate, you're chewing through 5 cents a minute at the moment with your bill, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you extrapolate that out at your current trajectory, this might cost you $300 this month, you know? So all of a sudden you're going to be able to go, holy shit, how many air conditioners have I got on right now? Kids, like, turn off your air conditioners, you're not in your rooms, like all of these sort of things. So it's going to enable a lot better navigation as humans around how we interact with the world and where we're actually using these services. And I think it's just a really, really understated and just that's only enabled through our frictionless ability to transfer payments at scale for low cost. So if I can just highlight back to how those systems sort of compare with the traditional sort of banking system and the exchange rates and transferring of payments there, it's typically done as a percentage of the value that is transferred. So if you transfer, $100 and it's a 7% fee, it's going to cost you $7 to transfer that value across. Whereas with the Bitcoin base layer, it's more about the data. We don't give a shit how much value you're actually sending from one to another. It's about the data that you're taking up in that block space. So it doesn't matter if I send $10 or I send $1 million. If the data's the same, the fee's going to be the same. And I'll probably leave it there. I won't dig into because the Lightning Network does actually, there's a different fee structure on the Lightning Network. So we might sort of, if anyone's got anything else, we might start to touch base on how the Lightning Network works, and then we can talk about fee structures and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I like it. Where to start? Should we start with just a basic description of how Lightning works? And I guess before we even do that, let me just say, to clarify, the beautiful thing about Bitcoin is that, and I think I said this in our last episode, because of the unchangeability and the predictability of the base layer, what's being built on Bitcoin has the potential to change everything. Kind of like you said, Josh, the use cases and applications of Bitcoin are even hard to predict for a hardcore Bitcoiner because it's open source and programmable. That base layer, the game theory and how it's designed indicates it's probably not going to change. It's a set of Legos or it's a ruler that all these other carpenters can work off of and create these second layers. So that's what Lightning is. It wasn't here when Bitcoin started. Somebody thought up the Lightning protocol, unleashed it into the wild, and it just happens to be the one that's proliferated the most. It's not the only second layer in existence, and it won't be the only second layer into perpetuity. We don't even know if it'll assuredly be the one that wins out long term, but it's here and it works. And I think maybe to start, I'll give this to Seb or Daz if you guys are ready to kind of give a description for someone that has no clue how Lightning works and how it increases throughput and accomplishes some of the things we've hinted at. What is the Lightning Network?
So there's probably a couple of angles we should frame up with this. As a Lightning node operator is one thing, and as a Lightning wallet interaction, that's a separate thing. So I might just start with framing up how the Lightning Network works. And the probably easiest way for us to demonstrate that is like, say, okay, Dan and Josh, you just work together all the time. You spend a lot of time together, and say, you're always getting smoko on lunch together, and you're going to the pub. And it's always around, I'll just get the coffee today. I'll get lunch today. I'll buy dinner. Beers are on me. And you're always paying each other back. So one way you may choose to think about this is to open up a Lightning channel with yourselves, right? So this gets probably beyond the beginner's level, like going to this, but it's just important to highlight the infrastructure and the architecture behind how these things work. So Dan and Josh are going to open up a Lightning channel together. Basically what that means is they pre-sign an on-chain transaction together. They're coordinating together. They know each other, right? And we say, we're going to open up a channel. Dan initiates it, and he say, okay, we're going to open this up with very big fee, right? Let's say we're going to open up 1 Bitcoin channel between us. Dan initiates that. He funds it with 1 Bitcoin. He trusts Josh. Josh, in a separate transaction, sends him the other half of a Bitcoin. And then basically Dan pushes half of the Bitcoin over to Josh's side. So what we've basically got is a funded channel with liquidity on both sides. So we've got half a Bitcoin on each side. Now that we've opened up that channel between us, this is existing now on the second layer. It's existing on Bitcoin. So the only thing that the base chain sees is that you've opened up a channel. And you've both pre-signed a message in there, which is important to highlight, and I'll loop back later on, you've both pre-signed a message there that any one of you can initiate a channel closure. So we've opened up a channel. We've got half a Bitcoin on each side. Now what happens is, using that Lightning protocol, you guys can enact, think of it like an abacus. Dan's got an abacus, and half the liquidity is on his side, and on the other half of that abacus is Josh's liquidity. So when you guys initiate a transaction, Josh buys the coffee today, right? So Dan says, don't worry, mate, I'll send you back some sats. So we're going to flip over one of the beads on the abacus over to Josh's side. So the channel liquidity is still, the balance is the same for the channel, but now we've just got more of those beads sitting over in Josh's side. And if this goes on, Dan's always buying the coffee and we're always flicking beads back over to Josh's side. Later on, if we choose to close that channel down, it basically is pre-signed. It goes back to the base layer, and whatever the balance was at the time gets pushed back to the base layer protocol. So we know that the stack of that one Bitcoin liquidity that we opened up on that channel, the larger side of that stack is on Josh's side, and it goes back to Josh's address that he initiated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And it's a great analogy for Josh and I, particularly because we're both especially gifted at flicking beads. Wouldn't you agree? Josh, sure. that's a strength.
It just takes the right frequency, you know. You just gotta up and down until you find the right one.
Howdy, plebs. It is Dan here. I want to take a minute to talk to you about Crowd Health. What Crowd Health is doing in the healthcare space is nothing short of remarkable. If you're already familiar with Crowd Health, you can visit joincrowdhealth.com/BCB and use code BLUE for a tantalizing 3-month trial discount. As you probably know by now, the two of us are career firefighter paramedics. Nearly 70% of our calls are medical related, and we both rotate over to an ambulance. We're the first link in the chain in the healthcare system, and we see just how broken it is. Injured and sick patients stressed out of their mind, primarily worried about the incoming hospital bill. Crowd Health offers an extremely simplistic and workable alternative to traditional healthcare setups for a freaking fraction of typical premiums. It's essentially the decentralization of healthcare, leveraging the power of Bitcoin alongside healthcare crowdfunding to drastically uncomplicate healthcare and give back control to patients. Crowd Health negotiates bills for their members and finds them the best doctors and hospitals. Do yourself a favor. Visit joincrowdhealth.com/BCB. That's joincrowdhealth.com/BCB. And use code BLUE during sign up to receive a max discount crowdfunding request of $49 a month. Yes, $49 for the first 3 months. The Blue Collar Bitcoin podcast is brought to you by arguably the most legendary company in Bitcoin, CoinKite. They are the producers of the renowned Cold Card, the world's most trusted and secure Bitcoin signing device, built with a plethora of features fit for Bitcoin beginners all the way up to the most advanced of users. This device is a one-stop shop for your Bitcoin custody needs, and something the two of us have trusted for years. CoinKite also manufactures the BlockLock, a gorgeous e-ink digital display art piece sitting in the background of what seems to be every serious Bitcoiner on the planet. BlockLock can be programmed to scroll through key Bitcoin metrics, including price, hash rate, next halving date, and much more. Boy, oh boy, will this thing look good in your living room or office. They are also the makers of many other security and fun products for all users, no matter their technical aptitude. Support our show and get a delicious discount on CoinKite products by following our affiliate link on the screen and in the notes, and using code BCB for 5% off the Cold Card.
If I can, just before we circle back, we'll just go one layer deeper as well. And now say Josh and Seb have a relationship. Dan doesn't know Seb, but Josh and Seb have a relationship, a similar relationship.
They flick each other's beads. Yep, I'm tracking.
They flick each other's beads all the time. And Dan doesn't want a part of it because he's a bit jealous.
He likes to watch, though. He wants to watch the beads.
Josh and Seb open up a channel with themselves. They've got liquidity. And say we all go out for beers, right? And then Seb ends up buying a whole heap of beers, and at the end of the night, it's like, hey, you know what, guys? You owe us $30 $cuck equivalent. So Dan doesn't have to open up a channel with Seb, but through routing, through the Lightning Network, basically all we need is Seb's address, and then this needs to have a route through to Seb. And it just so happens we have a route. It's through Josh. So Dan and Josh have a channel together. Josh and Seb have a channel together. Dan wants to send Seb sats. It goes and routes through Josh's node. So it goes from Dan to Josh to Seb, and then Josh as the intermediary for his trouble of providing liquidity to that channel, providing the ability to transfer payment. He might scalp a little payment, value for value, out of the side as a routing fee to route through him to somebody else. So then when you start to extrapolate that out globally, there is a whole network of very well-connected nodes with very well-connected channels with a lot of liquidity between various service providers. And that's where the difference lies between you having to operate a channel and you actually just being able to use the Lightning Network. I have personally used Lightning, open up Lightning channels because I wanted just to experience. But for me to maintain them I don't have a high use case throughput. I don't really have a need to have a channel. But I use the Lightning Network all the time. So I don't need to necessarily run a channel. I just need to use a wallet that's got very well connected liquidity, such as like Wallet of Satoshi as an example. It's a very well connected node with a lot of well connected channels. So anywhere that I want to send a Lightning payment, I'm basically routing through this network of channels now to basically get to the end user. And it doesn't matter if the person I want to send funds to is on Wallet of Satoshi or Moon Wallet or any of these other Lightning service providers, I'm theoretically, the network is that huge now that I can find a route through that connection, and that's where I'm paying fees. I'll probably just throw it out. Seb's got his thing up for a while there. Sorry, Seb.
Oh, no sweat at all. I was just going to add one kind of important point, which is the fact that when we're talking about the Lightning Network, because it doesn't necessarily operate on the proof of work mining system that the Bitcoin base layer operates on, this is what allows it to have much cheaper fees. And so to highlight that, exactly what Daz is talking about, if we're operating on the base layer, we're operating on Bitcoin, those fees range depending on any time throughout the year from 50 cents or 10, well, I'd say probably 10, 15 cents all the way up to 5, 10, 15 bucks. And so if you wanted to go and buy coffee, let's just say Josh and Dan in the example, over the next month, have 20, 30, let's just say 30 transactions between the two of them. Well, if they're $1 a transaction, we're talking about $30 in transaction fees. Whereas when we're talking about, if you move that Bitcoin off the main layer into Lightning and then perform those transactions on Lightning over the month and then bring it back to the base layer again, all of a sudden those 30 transactions, when we're talking about Lightning, we're talking about a couple sats. We're talking about like a fraction of a cent. So that in total may have cost, let's just say, 5 cents to perform those 30 transactions instead of paying that $30. So this is where for smaller transactions, and that's obviously dependent on what you feel comfortable with, but I'd say anything below a couple $100, if you're performing those transactions on Lightning, you're saving yourself a lot of fees.
Yeah, it's really good point. So I always liken it to use the Lightning Network like you would a wallet, like your everyday cash system. So, I'm not buying coffee, I'm not buying bread, I'm not buying, everyday items on the Bitcoin base layer because the fees over time would just be too cost prohibitive for me to do it. So I move funds into Lightning and I use those as a smaller, and we'll talk about the trade-offs in a minute of what we're trading off when we actually move to that second layer because there are absolutely trade-offs. But what we're trying to do is just minimize the transaction, the friction for smaller payments. And I don't need it on the base layer. I don't need to have immutability necessarily for my coffee transaction. I just need to know, we just need to be comfortable in that transaction between the sender and the receiver that has been enacted. And the other thing to highlight, which is an important feature of the Lightning Network, is I mentioned before Dan and Josh opened this channel up. None of those microtransactions make their way back down to the base layer. It's only so there's a lot more privacy enhancement around those individual transactions. What money moved when and where sits on that second layer, and it never makes its way. That history never makes its way back down to the base layer. So we've spoken about the base layer being sort of pseudonymous. They're immutable. Nobody knows the address unless you give up that privacy yourself. But all of those transactions are on the blockchain for anybody to see forever. So if you want a little bit more privacy in your transaction, you can step up into those second layers, use that Lightning Network because those transactions are never going to be back down onto the base layer. The only thing that gets recorded back to the base layer is the final settlement when you choose to withdraw back to the base chain, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So there's 3 advantages here in my, so you have trust because everything eventually on Lightning once it's all settled back and forth. If you don't trust the other character, he doesn't trust you, you can bring this back to the Bitcoin blockchain. You can have it settled finally there. So that's a huge plus here. You're basically leaning on Bitcoin itself, the base layer, for all of the trust that you need to operate Lightning. And then you're gaining speed and you're gaining instant liquidity. This means that, like Dan mentioned earlier, this is the physical Bitcoin moving to the other party right now. There's no intermediary and there's no debt that needs to be held by one party or the other. And by debt, without debt, there's even less trust involved because you don't have to trust that other person is going to produce the Bitcoin they say they have. They've actually physically moved it. The abacus at every node on the way there and all the way back has moved those pieces on the way up and on the way back. And then the other thing was, which you just mentioned, Daz, which is privacy. And this might be going a little bit deeper than we want to for this, but each one of the nodes along the hop, from me to Daz, with say 20 different intermediaries in between, they use something called onion routing, which means they don't know, the intermediaries don't know where this transaction came from, and they don't know inevitably where it's going to lead. So it's blind all the way from me and all the way back to me. So there's a lot to gain from this and using it on this tertiary layer. Can I just
give a really good example of that onion routing and how that works? So
sure.
Say we're going to go through ourselves again. So I'm going to pay to Dan. Dan will pay to Josh. Josh will route. Sorry, I should say routing, not payment. So I want to send a payment through to Seb, but I've got to hop through Dan and Josh before I get to Seb through that routing network. So when I initiate that transaction, I've got Seb's address. It then goes and scans for the most efficient route. I might be optimizing for time, or I might be optimizing for fee, and that's all dependent on the architecture of the wallet, right? But basically, what then happens is I'm signing a transaction, and I'm putting it in an envelope, and then Dan's going to have so for Josh's layers, going to put it in another envelope, and then Dan's going to put it in another envelope. So there's a couple of layers of envelopes here. So Dan can't see that I want to send it to Seb. So all Dan gets is an envelope that says send some money to Josh, and you can scalp a little fee on the way. So Dan just gets his envelopes that says, send Josh 1 Bitcoin. So he opens up that envelope, he scalps his fee, and he sends it onto Josh. And then Josh just gets this envelope and says he doesn't know it come from Daz. But Josh gets this envelope that says then, I've got to send some money to Seb. So he's got that envelope and he sends it on. Then Seb finally gets it and he says, I've got a history here and I'm going to pull it out. He actually knows it's come from me, but that's another just layer of obscurities through that transfer so that nobody actually knows. Like Dan can't see the destination because all he's getting is the next instruction of where he needs to send his liquidity, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So some built-in privacy. Not perfect on Lightning, but I think improved over the base layer. And I think it's worth saying, back to the open source programmability of Bitcoin, Lightning is a privacy upgrade over the base layer, and we will continue. And we are seeing things like Arc, which we talked about recently. We're seeing that these layers that are going to be built, they are going to quickly and efficiently improve fungibility and privacy. To wrap a little bit of this for someone that is confused, for someone that's maybe studied a little bit, this has been an enlightening 20 minutes. For someone else, they might be like, what the hell is going on here? Because it did take me a little bit of time to digest what the fuck's going on with Lightning. I want to say a couple things to that sort of listener. First of all, you don't have to understand the inner workings of systems for us to say that those systems work. Let's even take the payment rails you use. When you execute a transaction on Venmo, do you really know what's happening in the background to where Chase and Bank of America settle? You don't. And there's a ton of shit that happens when you use Venmo. You have no idea. When you stream a video on Netflix, you don't know what's going on the back end with the internet, but you get a wonderful product with some popcorn next to your wife on a Friday night. The same thing is true here with the Lightning Network. It works. It's working. Josh, you highlighted some great summary points. It's trusted, instant payments with unlimited throughput, essentially, that are cheap. And it has one other killer application, which I think we would be remiss not to highlight, and that's payment network inclusion, gentlemen, because a huge percent of the world is unbanked, and open source software with apps built on it making use of Lightning gives people in the world payment capability that would never have payment capability before. This is what I love about Lynn's work, is she really helps first world folks zoom out of their own monetary privilege and start asking some basic questions like, How would you reliably and cheaply send $97 back to your parents in Bolivia, let's say? If you're a podcaster in Egypt who's blowing up, how do you make money? These are answers that people have built solutions to, but Bitcoin is a globally distributed, increasingly liquid network that now has payments capability. That's a huge upgrade to the micropayments thing. We're no longer talking about cents. We're talking about thousands of a cent and unlocking all sorts of payment empowering applications. So this does have an inclusion component, and that's the beauty of Bitcoin that's much different than the walled garden that is 21st century banking. Just because you have Venmo and Cash App and stuff that sounds like Lightning to you doesn't mean other people don't, or that other people do. So you have to realize how radically inclusive this is on the global stage.
One other thing, just really quick, it's also possible to send messages. You could use this for, well, basically, like something like you imagine, like there's people in a third world country that don't have a bank account. There's also people that have all of their messages sniffed through by the dictatorial regime, who cannot necessarily send secure messages to somebody outside of their country or even within their country. There's applications. One of them is called Zion, which is a decentralized social network that's being built on Lightning as well. So there's just other human interest technologies that are being built on this that can be good for the world, other than just a payments network. And whichever one pays the fees and actually makes the most sense is the one that will win, because the economics will end up shaking out what doesn't make sense on this and what does. But I think it's important to understand that this protocol has the ability to carry other things than just Bitcoin necessarily.
Seb.
Yeah, I wanted to make one good point, or 2 points actually, that you kind of brought up, Dan, which is like Bitcoin. For those that are kind of unfamiliar with kind of the memes around Bitcoin, one of the key tenets of Bitcoin is don't trust, verify. And Dan brings up this amazing point, which is the fact that when it comes to Bitcoin, because it is open source, if we have the interest, anyone is able to dig in to the functionality of Bitcoin. And like the Lightning Network, we've spent between the four of us countless hours digging into this stuff. And of course, the deeper understanding of it is probably still over my head, but being able to dig into that and knowing that we can dig into that allows us to have a system which anyone is able to verify if they feel the need to, or if they or the desire. Whereas our current system lives on a don't verify trust. We have to trust that the system has our best interests at heart, and the system has shown countless times, like in Canada, where they'll freeze people's funds during the trucker rally or so on, where the system is not necessarily listening to the individuals or supporting the individuals, and freedom and rights usually slip by the wayside. And then the other final point that I wanted to mention, which is, as we're talking about earlier, we mentioned Bitcoin has around a transaction speed of around 7 transactions per second. But when we're talking about Lightning, all of a sudden you got to realize that one Bitcoin transaction, which could be Dan and Josh opening a channel on the Lightning Network, could encompass thousands of transactions on the Lightning Network. And so although the main layer, the base layer of Bitcoin may only see one transaction, when people say, well, Bitcoin is only able to process 7 transactions per second, we're only talking about the base layer. Those transactions can have many hundreds, if not millions of transactions above that we're not seeing. So Bitcoin is able to reach a much broader market just through other technologies built on top, which is what we're trying to kind of explain.
Yeah.
And we've touched on a couple of times now this notion around the difference between Bitcoin the asset and Bitcoin the network. And for my mind, Bitcoin the network is the really global shift in thinking. So Bitcoin the network is the payment rails that enable us to transfer value. Bitcoin the asset is the dollar-denominated thing that experiences volatility. And I think from a global adoption perspective, it's the asset that scares people off because of that volatility. You know, the fluctuations in the market price, whereas the real value in my mind is the network, is these layers getting built on top of it. And, you know, like Dan said before, it's banking the unbanked. And that just sounds like a fluffy bit of a few words, but it is such a profound notion that, like, all you need now is access to a mobile phone and an internet connection, and you can transfer digital bearer asset finality settlement value transfers globally. And I've got a couple of examples of this. So I was able to, one day, Daniel Prince was in a coffee shop in the UK, and he throws up a Lightning network and says, hey, there's some random people walked into this coffee shop who's now accepting Lightning payments. he put up a QR code on Twitter and he put it out there and he said, anyone want to shout this couple a coffee? And I just happened to be the first to see it. You know, I was just doom scrolling through Twitter, and I transferred, I think it was the equivalent of $5 Australian instantaneously and for near free. It was less than a cent of transaction fee. It was a couple of sats fee for me to transfer a coffee from Australia all the way to the UK. And like, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you've ever tried to move value across borders before, that was impossible only a short couple of years ago. And like, you still wouldn't be able to do it today, like through the Swift network. So you've got to route through so many hops, and the transaction fees, exchange fees, foreign exchange fees are so cumbersome that it becomes, you will never ever send $5 worth of value from Australia to the UK because the transaction fees alone are
just eat it up.
Completely going to make that not worthwhile. And where the value of that really rings true is in countries like El Salvador and in Tonga. Both, you know, there's a politician in Tonga as well, Lord Fusatua, who's been flagging that this is going to change the way that small countries like this operate, because their GDP,
Absolutely.
their bottom line is so dependent on remittances. So these impoverished sort of countries that don't have a lot of infrastructure, resources, manufacturing, all that sort of, they don't have anything to export. So what they export is their people. You know, their kids grow up, they save up their money, they send their kids, like from Tonga, they send them to Australia. They come to Australia to get schooled, they go to university, try and get good jobs, and then most of their GDP back in Tonga is through remittances from the family members who were exported, the talent that was exported, sending money back home. Now, when you've got these extractive layers in between, that's eroding the value transfer. And what it's done for El Salvador is increased, I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but it's improved their bottom line GDP by large percentage points, purely based on the fact that if I'm sending $100 worth of value from the States to $100 back to the El Salvador, we're actually seeing the majority of that $100 landing in El Salvador for productive use, rather than Western Union, as an example, standing in the middle, who can extract fees upwards of 30%. So that $100, you're paying $30 in transaction fees, let alone the friction that then exists for that person to be able to physically receive it. They've got to, most of the time, get on a bus, travel 4 hours to their local Western Union branch, only to be met with gangs on the outside saying, hey, we know what you're here for. You're going to be getting some money. Look, we won't stab you. Just give us $10 worth of that. So now all of a sudden that $100 is now only worth $60. So that productive capacity then has been diminished by 40%, purely based on the fact that we just wanted to simply transfer value from one place to another across the globe.
I was going to add quickly, which is, we've just actually, Daz and myself, we've just been writing a course, and it touches on Tonga. And Tonga is one of the highest remittances in the world. So that 46% of their GDP comes from remittances. And so if you've got 46% of your GDP coming from remittances, and the Western Union fee to send money back to Tonga is, I think it's something like 22% after you account for exchange rate transaction fees and so on. And so let's just say it's, I don't know, 50% remittance fees with a 20%, 50% of GDP is from remittances, 20% fee. That means that you can increase GDP by 10% a year.
Just don't do public math. Don't do public math. So
yeah. It's insane, though. That's crazy. It's crazy, the implications for that sort of individual and family.
100%. It would put
even for the first world, if you think about
countries.
When you think about the transfer of, say, dollars from here to pounds in Britain, if you were deciding to send it in Bitcoin, they have to sell the Bitcoin. There's a taxable event going on for probably both parties. In the situation where what Mahler's has done with Strike is an instant transmission into Bitcoin, moving to whatever other country you're sending it to, transferring it back into the local currency. And it happens so fast that, as you said, Daz, we're talking about the Bitcoin network versus the Bitcoin itself. You're not taking any real exchange risk there because it's only sitting on the network for like 1 second. There's not going to be any real movement in that 1 second. And you're also avoiding these fees because Bitcoin is looked at as a commodity. If you hold it and you sell it, you have to pay taxes on it. So you're avoiding two different problems, even for people in the first world, not to mention all of the myriad of huge improvements this is for avoiding Western Union in the third world.
Guys, I'm sure all of us will agree that when you start studying Bitcoin, you realize how muddy the current waters are financially. Like there's so much friction in the 21st century with money. It's crazy. And here comes Bitcoin. And we were talking about this with Tour de Meester recently, just a timing and technology match. That's really what Bitcoin is. It's a wonderful technology that works great. And the timing is perfect for its arrival, because we live in this overwhelmingly friction-filled 21st century monetary environment. There's 180 fucking fragmented fiat currencies. Here comes Bitcoin. It's frictionless money. Now with Lightning, it's instantaneous. There is such an obvious need for a digitally native, interoperable, trustless global value transfer protocol. And that's what Bitcoin is. And now it's doing it at the speed of light, in any denomination you want, big or small. And Josh, your point about, and Daz, you too, about this asset versus the network, you don't even need to hold Bitcoin. Bitcoin is an increasingly liquid asset that trades in virtually all large currency pairs. It allows someone, as you said, Josh, to use the payments aspect of the Lightning Network quite separately from using Bitcoin, the volatile asset. And it can serve as a fast settlement system to move dollars and other fiat currencies using Bitcoin liquidity, which is now global and rolling downhill. It does so many things. Remittances, it's the new 21st century currency exchange. Bye-bye currency exchanges. No need for you anymore. This is all happening without anyone in the middle for way, way cheaper. And once you start to see all this stuff we're unpacking, gentlemen, you just realize it's only a fucking matter of time. It's so much better. It's such a dramatic upgrade. As Booth says, this is a 10x plus upgrade. It's only a matter of time before the blinking light of utility draws people in like flies to a light, because it works so much better, even for people that don't want to hold Bitcoin. That's the crazy part.
Yeah, and that's such an understated point. And I think this is where some Bitcoiners within, especially if you spend some time on Twitter, you can get embroiled in a little bit of toxicity around, and it comes from a place of privilege. So if you're a Bitcoin maxi in the States, you absolutely cannot see value in anything other than Bitcoin. But in some of these impoverished countries, they can't afford the short-term volatility of Bitcoin. So we're always advocating for the fact that you treat Bitcoin like your long-term savings account. But we're not asking you to marry Bitcoin. We're just asking that people understand the network and the fundamental, and the payment rails and what that's enabling for these impoverished countries that live in a hyperinflationary world. You jump onto the Bitcoin network in order to transfer your value, and you hop off and you put that in whatever you need to in order to pay your bills and buy your bread and buy your milk. Because those further rails for you to be able to do that, they're not there yet. I think it's a matter of time before they are globally accepted as, like El Salvador's done. They've started to basically mandate the fact that you must accept Bitcoin. If people want to pay in Bitcoin, and I don't necessarily agree with mandates or anything like that, but it's just to highlight that eventually, as the hardest money that's ever been invented, people will want to accept it, but we're not there yet. So I've got no issue with, what I take issue with, and we can briefly touch on stablecoins. Okay. I've got issue with stablecoins where they're issued, and the fact that there's, I think there's a lot of work to be done around highlighting the risks that people do take when they do use stablecoins. The fact that there's a centralized issuer. We're going back to this system of centralized issuance and this trust system that you've got to put in that centralized entity. However, there is absolutely a use case for stablecoins as a relative stance between where you're coming from in your financial privilege. So if you're in Nigeria and you're experiencing hyperinflation of your base currency, what you're forced to use, and the US dollar stablecoin is something that you can use in order to transact value in the short term, that's less extractive than the hyperinflationary currency you're experiencing, there is absolutely a use case. And I think we just need to be a little bit more open-minded on the blinders that we sometimes have with Bitcoin only, Bitcoin only, Bitcoin only. Because if all you make is $10 a week and that's your whole family's livelihood, you're not going to be able to put up with the short-term volatility of Bitcoin to stack and use that whole $10 worth of value in Bitcoin over that short term. But it's more about the education around that's going to protect your value into the future. If you do have that $1 spare, you are way better off to stack that over a long time in Bitcoin. But absolutely, you're going to need to jump in and off those payment rails in order to satisfy your immediate need of feeding your family.
Start9 operating system is a full-fledged, cutting-edge Linux operating system. Its functionality and adaptability make it an excellent choice for the users who value simplicity, efficiency, and privacy. Running a Bitcoin node? Start9 is your go-to solution. Setting up a node has never been so easy. With a Start9 server, backups are more than just an afterthought. At the push of a button, create encrypted backups, ensuring your data stays safe and sound, out of the reach of big tech companies. Start9's commitment to security goes even further. StartOS is encrypted for all LAN communications. This ensures your passwords and assets are always protected. The StartOS marketplace of apps includes everything from Lightning to secure messaging apps to secure password management. If you care to be sovereign in the digital age, running a StartOS server is a must. And the best part? You can download and set up StartOS on any machine, or you can purchase a plug-and-play Start9 server directly from Start9. Choose Start9 for a secure, streamlined, and flexible computing experience. When Dan and I are at the firehouse and we have finally delivered the orange pill to a new plebe, we recommend Swan for their first Bitcoin purchase, always. Swan has the user interface absolutely nailed. We have seen people go from no-coiners to Bitcoiners in under a minute. It's just that easy. The problem with sending friends and family to other exchanges is exposing them to all kinds of BS. You will never see Swan encourage your friends or family to buy Dogecoin. Instead, Swan educates. Swan produces some of the best educational content in the space. That is a big freaking deal. The difference between somebody who buys on a whim and sells for a loss and those that hold for the long term is simply an education gap. We have been using Swan to dollar cost average into Bitcoin every single day since 2020. If you want a family member to turn into a Bitcoiner, there is no better place to go than Swan. For daily DCA, IRA, or education, Swan is the place to go. You can try Swan Premium on us for free. This includes exclusive Swan content, market insights, and other discounts. Click on our link in the show notes and use password BlueCollarBitcoin.
Daz, I think you make a great point. And I wanna add two things. The first one is that if you're investing in a protocol that your main argument for that protocol existing and the underlying asset that's providing liquidity existing is that, let's say it moves fiat collateralized stablecoins. Be careful. This doesn't mean that fiat collateralized stablecoins are evil or bad. I get the use case, but they're going to go to the best, cheapest, most reliable bidder. Okay. And so what's working now on Ethereum or Tron might be working on something completely different in the future. So even as we look through this lens of stablecoins, ask yourself, what's the staying power of the protocol you're investing on? I bring this up because we're not going to have time in this episode to go deep on these other protocols, but like Taro is built on the Lightning Network. It was built by Lightning Labs, and it can be used to move other types of assets using Bitcoin, right? Like USD collateralized stablecoins. So Bitcoin is, if is going to be around for a long time. It's going to be reliable. It's going to be robust, and it could start eating a lot of these other crypto use cases. So if you are someone that's interested in investing in the underlying asset of the protocol, I do strongly agree with Lynn's words, which we hinted at earlier from her piece, which is essentially that store of value, an actual fundamental use case of the base layer bearer asset in the protocol, sort of does precede medium of exchange. Like there has to be a reason to want to move the money. Right now, there is reliability in the base layer of legacy system, that being treasuries and everything that makes up, the base layer of 21st century finance. That's why people want USD or USD stablecoins. But I think we're just going to increasingly see as time goes on, in my opinion, you're going to see people wanting the major fiat currencies and wanting Bitcoin, because these are things that actually solve real problems and are reliable. And I do think Bitcoin will continue to likely subsume more of these external applications. We started to see this with ordinals. We could see this with stable coins. That's just my take at this point.
I absolutely think it's only a matter of time before a stablecoin will be issued on Bitcoin. And I think that's why it's so important to highlight that at the moment, these stablecoins are not decentralized. They're decentralized in name only, and the protocols that they're built upon are decentralized in name only. So you are not only taking an inherent amount of risk in the issuer of that stablecoin, but you're also taking an inherent amount of risk on the networks that they're built upon. And like I said, I think Bitcoin. We've said many times on this pod that Bitcoin is the fundamental underlying protocol upon which everything else will be built, and it's only a matter of time before a stablecoin is built upon a Bitcoin protocol-based protocol. And it's probably a good segue, guys, if you want to jump into sidechains and so forth. So that's a lot of the use cases for other sort of digital assets can and do live on sidechains. So Liquid is a good example of this. Now, I'm not going to pretend I'm a Liquid expert in any stretch of the imagination, but basically what these sidechains are kind of built upon in parallel with Bitcoin. So it's not necessarily a layer on top of Bitcoin, but very much a parallel layer of Bitcoin. And the sort of premise behind this is there may be a use case whereby you might have some other sort of digital asset that you want to trade in, right? So one of these things, so for Liquid, for example, I liken it to, or my understanding anyway, is I liken it to like a cloak room at a club or something like that. You got a big heavy jacket on, you're going into the club, you go to the cloak room, they issue you a stub for your cloak, you go and check your cloak in. Now, inside that club, we might be, for whatever reason, we might want to swap over those stubs. But basically, you're checking your claim of Bitcoin. You're checking your Bitcoin at the door. They hand you another stub for another claim to something else. And this could have a myriad of different use cases, right? And this is not to talk about shitcoinery necessarily, like, tokens and all that sort of thing. But there are other assets that you might want to check in at the door. And Fedi's another good example I'll talk about in a second around how this sort of concept works. But on the way back out, I just hand my stub back in, I get my Bitcoin. So that's theoretically how a sidechain kind of works, and my understanding around how Fedi might work as well. So there's this other protocol which is very much in its infancy, starting to get a bit of traction around federations. So how they are sort of posed to work is that if you don't necessarily, one use case is you don't necessarily want to hold your keys. And I don't want to get bogged down into a custody discussion. We've covered that in a previous episode. But if you're not necessarily comfortable holding your keys, you can enter into these federated mints where you put a bit of trust in your network of people. So say, again, us 4 people here, I'm not very technically minded, so I might, put a bit of trust in Dan, Josh, and Seb to run this federation and manage my assets. But this eCash is another example of this. I'm going to check my Bitcoin at the door, then I get an equivalent eCash because I'm in this federated mint. So I'm putting an inherent level of trust in this mint and how it works. But again, it's like obscuring our transactions. We can settle transactions within our little community. And it's coming back to sort of that lightning aspect as example that I used earlier with the abacus. When I check back out, if my balance when I entered that mint is the same as when I'm checking back out, I can check my Bitcoin back out onto the base chain. So these are the sort of things that are also starting to get built on side chains. So like going back to the Liquid example, that's where a stable coin could potentially be built on as a side chain. You check your Bitcoin in on the way in, you go in, you transfer it to another asset, you're going to transfer in that asset, and whatever the Bitcoin denominated value is, and this is the paradigm shift, like what is that worth now in Bitcoin terms on my way back out, I hand my stub back in and I get whatever that value is worth on the way back out. And that's the easiest way I can sort of think about those sort of things.
When I wanted to just
the way you described that, it made me just immediately, I think the easier way for people to think about it is just going to a casino. Like you bring your cash, you trade it for chips, and then so the federation is made out of 11 or 15 different companies, and 11 of them have to sign. So you have this trade-off there between, obviously you don't have to trust each one of those individuals, but you can trust that 11 out of the 15 of them are going to be honest. So you are giving up a layer of security from Bitcoin, but you're also in a federation that has to have a whole lot of bad actors for them to steal from you. Yeah. And the other thing, just as an aside on Liquid before we move on from it, it is actually another functioning blockchain, but it is operating at a much faster speed. I believe it's 1 minute blocks that are in Liquid. So once you lock up that money into that multi-sig wallet, they issue these tokens, the casino chips that you go to the casino with. You can play in the casino all day long. And then when you come back, they take those tokens and they burn them, and then they give you back your Bitcoin. So
that's a really good analogy. That's way better. Well done.
No, I think you did it. I just immediately thought casino chips the way you were describing it.
Yeah, it's really good.
Well, I was just going to say, you talked about the cloakroom, Daz, and handing in your cloak. I didn't take you for a kind of guy that walks around with a cloak.
I was thinking strip club when you started that whole
I don't
spiel.
even. You know what? I don't even have a cloakroom. We're in Australia.
Is that what they
30
call,
degrees Celsius?
They call like bougie coats cloaks?
No,
no,
it's
down under. Is that?
It's like the Dracula bit.
I think of like Lord of the Rings when I hear the word cloak.
Yeah,
no, I'm always rocking around. You remember that Seinfeld episode where he's got the Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat and he's pimping that Kramer down the street? That's Daz rocking around cans.
Yeah,
on the Esplanade.
The other protocol I was going to mention is ARC. I forget which episode we talked about this recently, Josh. Don't know a ton about it. We need to do a deep dive, maybe a whole episode on it. But it's a layer 2 solution that settles to the Bitcoin base layer like Lightning, but it doesn't have the same liquidity constraints as Lightning. There's no need to run an always on server. Don't understand all the mechanics yet at this point. We need to do a deep dive. But the point is, we've named Lightning, which is really the main front runner right now, ARC, Taro, which is built on Lightning, Fediment, Liquid. These are all examples of things that people can try on top of Bitcoin. The wonderful thing, which we'll round back to, is that there are not the same gatekeepers in this protocol that there are in legacy finance. Nobody can tell you, nope, you can't settle to commercial banks. You know, there are huge limits to who can innovate in traditional finance right now. Huge limits. Those limits don't exist in Bitcoin. It's bring it on, motherfucker. We'll see if it works. Great. If it doesn't, then you're obsoleted. Lightning has worked, and so it's proliferating. In my mind, Liquid at this point, I think it's very interesting. It's been a little bit of a dud. People thought it was going to be a really big deal. It hasn't really taken off. Such as Bitcoin. Innovate, try. That's how these layers are going to work. The ones that earn respect. It's a meritocracy here on the layers atop of Bitcoin, and there's always somewhere to retreat back to that's safe. That's the Bitcoin base layer.
Yeah.
Like the whole Bitcoin ethos bleeds through all this stuff, guys. Like conservatism, bare asset, trustlessness, a non-debt based system. These are all things that seem to permeate innovators through the layers, because the people that want to move Bitcoin tend to be wound this same way of wanting this thing to be robustly decentralized as it moves forward.
And the big litmus test, I think, with a lot of these technologies is no one's issued a token. So the wider crypto ecosystem is a great test net for, like, what's the future of digital assets and transfer, but it's so embroiled in scams and incentive schemes around these centralized bodies trying to make a quick buck. So if you've got, like, a file transfer system, you don't need a fucking token for that, right? And that's probably the big red flag when you start to, anybody new to this sort of technology and they're floating around, they're looking at all these various things. It's like, does it have a token? And what the fuck is it for? So anything worthwhile doing is being built on top of Bitcoin, and none of those that are doing it are issuing a token to raise funds or liquidity, right? It's all based on this free and open source sort of development, and it's creating an ecosystem where those people who contribute are getting rewarded through a value for value type of model. There are people like the Jack Dorseys of the world who are looking at these advancements in technology and the incentives that are behind the builders building these things. They're doing it for the betterment of the technology and the betterment of society, not for financial gain. So they're not issuing tokens. They're not trying to use retail investors, wage earners as exit liquidity to try and pump their bags. They're doing it because they see value in what they're building, and they are duly rewarded through these other, altruistic endeavors and altruistic people who, like, fast forward 10 years time and my bags of Bitcoin are going to be worth a hell of a lot more in purchasing power. Big God damned if I'm not going to contribute back to this, to the network. For
sure.
Who helped to improve my purchasing power and helped me lift myself out of, everyday wage earning, as a means of just being able to get ahead and provide for my family. I'm definitely going to be giving back to that, and probably very generously. And that's what we're experiencing now from people who have been in this ecosystem for quite a while, sitting on big bags. They're giving back. They're making sure that this thing is continually worked on for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons.
Yeah. It's important too to remember, like, this doesn't mean that these are the only tertiary layers that can exist. There's no limit. to how many of these second layers can be invented, can be tried, can fail, can succeed. And they don't add weight to the underlying base layer protocol. So we can have 1,000 different implementations of these second layer technologies or side chains. They can all be functioning simultaneously, and they don't have any effect on what happens in the base layer, which is where it all kind of folds back to in the end. And when we go back to kind of comparing and contrasting this to the traditional system, this, like Bitcoin with Lightning, is faster, less trust enabled, no debt. It's more usable, it's censorship resistant, and it's fungible all the way throughout. It is orders of magnitude. I think it was Peter Thiel that said, you need, in order to have a competing network compete with something that's entrenched, it needs at least a 10x improvement in order for it to gain traction. I think it's easy to say that this is at least a 10x improvement over the current system that we currently have in the world right now, for a whole myriad of reasons that we already went through today.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, like a perfect example is like you look at the traditional banking system, and after 2008, and they put through Dodd-Frank put so many hurdles on small banks that they just could not compete. So we've seen basically since 1980s to today, we've seen the US go from 25,000 bank branches to 6,000. Like we've just seen the decimation and the monopolization of the banking industry. And we're seeing it recently with, for those that are kind of been following the Silicon Valley bank collapse and these other bank collapses, all of a sudden we've seen FDIC, where they're now selecting big commercial banks where they're willing to up that $250,000 limit to unlimited. Whereas the small little local branches, they don't have that same benefit. So all of a sudden you're incentivizing the movement of money from small banks to big banks. Now, what has this got to do with Bitcoin? Bitcoin has none of this legislation in place. It's got none of this lobbying to create these monopolized industries. If the four of us wanted to start up our own project, our own side chain or our own kind of layer 2 solution, we can do that. And if it offers value, it allows creative destruction to take place. If we can outperform the Lightning Network, then we stand a chance of being able to do that. We don't have to fight these big commercial entities that lobby against the government to put regulation in place to impede us.
Totally.
There's no moat in Bitcoin.
The other thing that's worth mentioning, and this will be sort of my closing thought, is that these layers are important because when you think about proof of work and how the base layer functions, it's very unlikely that if our thesis plays out and Bitcoin becomes as valuable as we think, that average blokes like the four of us are going to be settling on the Bitcoin base layer very often at all. Fees are going to get really expensive. It's going to be a big deal to settle on the Bitcoin base layer. So most individuals in the future, if Bitcoin continues to march forward, are going, their Bitcoin, the Bitcoin that they own, is going to be on second layers. And it's going to second, third, fourth, fifth layers, I guess I should say. And it's going to get really easy, guys. Right now, Daz, you talked about messing with a Lightning node. Josh and I have too. We've messed with liquidity. There's some frictions there. There's some challenges for the average Joe. The user experience has gotten so much easier, even since we've been in, Josh, and it's going to continue to get a lot easier. And a lot of this is just going to become ubiquitous. You're not even going to know on what layer you're interacting with Bitcoin. I'm reminded of splicing that we learned about down in Miami. Dusty Damon was talking about it on the open source stage. And he was talking about how this new splicing development on Lightning is going to allow for the resizing of Lightning channels. Right now, one of the biggest applications that stood out to me is that there's sort of this two balance problem. You've got your base chain Bitcoin, you got your Lightning Bitcoin, the two balance issue. And what splicing, one of the things it could enable is just one balance wallets. So you're going to be moving Bitcoin between Lightning and the base layer and not even know what's going on. We bring up the analogy, but it's worth highlighting.
It's another, just to highlight like Seb's earlier point around, participation in this thing is as deep as you want to possibly go. If you want the deep dive and you want to fully understand it, it's accessible to you. You can. It takes a bit of work, but you can understand the ins and outs of this fundamental protocol. You try and do that into the traditional finance system, and it's just layers and layers and layers of obscurity. You don't know where funds are going and settling down. The other thing which I'd like, if you want to run a Lightning node, you can. That is absolutely within your power with access to some cheap, very cheap hardware. Try and fucking start a bank. As a comparison, basically the function you are providing is you're basically going to be, you know what? I want to be Visa. So the power is it's absolutely accessible to you as a human to go and become part of that Visa network. Whereas in the traditional finance system, that is way outside of your ability to even begin to think about as a single dude, earning wages. That's just such a profound thing to me. It just blows my mind that, and like you said earlier, Dan, if it's all above you, you don't need to understand. I don't need to understand how TCP/IP works. I don't need to understand the protocol that my email is using for me to send an email to Seb every day.
Totally.
Like, I don't need to know it, but if I want to, on the Bitcoin protocol, I can absolutely understand it.
And in that email example, Daz, sending an email was really, really complicated at one point, and now 87-year-old grandmothers are doing it. So be careful with Bitcoin, because if you're a boomer or someone else sitting around going, this will never work, it's too complicated. I tried to set up such and such and it didn't work. This will never scale. Think about if you said that about every other technology that's scaled. Think about the internal combustion engine. Think about the electrical grid. This will never work. Nobody can set it up. Well, look out, because it is working, and it's getting increasingly simple, and it's going to get startlingly simple to use Bitcoin. It already is, man. And so be careful, because it's moving out quick, especially when it can be developed on by anyone at any time.
Yeah, you might want some for a hedge position. Just a little.
Totally. And the nature of the open nature of this thing and open markets and, capitalism at its core is that services will be built to meet the needs. So there are trade-offs. There are absolutely trade-offs. We've spoken about this ad nauseum throughout this whole series around the trade-offs. And there are trade-offs with Lightning as well. You're trading off a little bit of security. You got to put a bit of trust in that network. You got to put a bit of trust in that wallet operator and the people behind that. There is an inherent level of trust that you've got to put in, but that's why you think about it in ways that we've spoken about in the past around. I don't keep my net wealth on Lightning. I don't keep my net wealth in a hot wallet. I keep my net wealth in the base layer, and I use that as my wallet, as my proxy for my wallet. If I'm happy to carry around $300 cash, I'm happy to carry around $300 worth of equivalent Bitcoin on a hot wallet. As soon as, I'm on an exchange, I'm looking to move that off into the base layer security. So there's always trade-offs. There's trade-offs with custody. And more services are going to meet the needs of people who interact with this protocol. Not everybody, unfortunately, as much as we want them to, are going to manage their own keys. So there will be trade-offs. There will be services. There are concierge services. There are third-party services like Unchained who can help you manage your keys in a 2 or 3 multi-sig. There are services always going to be built on top and on the side of these protocols to meet people where they are, so that it's more and more accessible. But like from the fundamental understanding of what this thing is, both the asset and the network, by God, you better hope you got some. Or you're starting to at least uncover what this thing is.
Get some. Get
it.
By the way, guys, through the course of this discussion, I've been distracted a couple times because I think this bed in my sister-in-law's bedroom actually is a king. It's a pretty big room. I think it's a king. So if by the off chance my sister-in-law is listening,
you can't identify it right off the bat.
It's a big room. It's a new environment. I was distracted by your beautiful faces, but I got a level. I think it is a king. It actually theoretically could be a California king because my brother-in-law is pretty tall. He's like 6'4".
Sure.
I will investigate
put it in the show notes.
and make
Whatever
sure
it turns out to be, let us know in the show notes.
I will let you folks know down below what I'm looking at.
We talked to Tour last week, and he said something that I think struck me as interesting, and I think it's true. He said that if you are a Bitcoin OG if you moved Bitcoin on the base chain, because 10 years from now, that's going to be a very rare event. Before we close this thing out, I want to say it one more time. I know, Dan, you mentioned it. I mentioned it. But if you want a really good one-stop shop for understanding a lot of this, Lynn Alden's piece, A Look at the Lightning Network, great resource. We'll link it in the show notes. Anyone else got anything?
If you get a single bed, you can stack more sats.
If you let your parents fuck in your bed, you can stack more sats. That's a lesson from
No, they can stack more sats because they're not paying rent.
Hey, micropayments, you can charge them by the minute.
Yeah. Hey, that's scary. All right, it's going to be 50 sats a minute, Mom and Dad. Gentlemen, this was awesome. I think we did second layers justice. Big topic, going to be increasingly important as Bitcoin moves out. Base layer gets more expensive. appreciate the hell out of you guys. Can't wait for next month. Enjoy that puppy, Daz.
Yeah. You boys too.
Thanks a lot, guys. That was awesome.